Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies here at Yale. My name is Tamar Gendler, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and I'm standing before you in the place of Ian Shapiro, Director of the Macmillan Center, who's unable to join you right now because he's away teaching a seminar. But it is a great honor to replace him standing before you because it's my pleasure to welcome an extremely distinguished lecturer to deliver an extremely distinguished lecture. So our speaker today, I suspect, needs very little introduction to most of you. AnneMarie Slaughter is the president and CEO of New America and the Bert Kerstetter University Professor Emerita of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. She holds a distinguished record both in academic and in policy leadership. She was the director of policy planning for the United States Department of State, the first woman to hold that position. And prior to her government service, Professor Slaughter served as Dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs for a 7-year period from 2002 to 2009. And prior to that, as the J. Sinclair Armstrong Professor of International, Foreign, and Comparative Law at the Harvard Law School from 1994 until 2002. She is the author or editor of a wide range of books, both books that address traditional academic subjects and books that touch on concerns of life in the public sphere. So she's author not only of A New World Order and The Idea That Is America, Keeping Faith with Our Values in Dangerous World, but also, more recently, of Unfinished Business, Women, Men, Work, and Family, an extraordinary volume which arose out of her 2012 article, Why Women Still Can't Have It All in the Atlantic, which quickly became one of the most widely read articles in the history of the magazine and sparked a renewed debate about the continued obstacles to genuine equality across gender lines. The talk that we will have the pleasure of hearing her deliver today is one of 3 lectures that she'll be giving as part of this series on the strategy of connection. They focus on the topics the chessboard and the web, which is the topic of today's lecture, network strategies for resilience, action, and scale, which will be the topic of her lecture tomorrow, and finally, on Friday, the third in the series, Power, Policy, and Leadership in a Networked World. The lecture series of which this trio is a part is the Stimson Lectures, which are sponsored by the Macmillan Center and the Yale University Press, funded by resources from an anonymous donor in honor of Henry L. Stimson, member of the Yale College class of 1889, attorney and statesman, whose government service culminated with his tenure as Secretary of War during the Second World War. Previous Stimson lecturers are individuals of the stature that a lecture series of this magnitude deserves. Previous lectures include Political Order in Changing Societies by Samuel P. Huntington, Financial Crises in Emerging Markets by Alexandra Lamfalussy, Arms and Influence by Thomas Schelling, The Arab Center, Promise of Modernization by Ambassador Marwan Mushar, Beyond the Democratic Maze by John Donne, What Happened to National Liberation by Michael Walzer, and The Imprint of Congress by our own David Mayhew. A distinguished series indeed, with a distinguished continuation. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor AnneMarie Slaughter.
I'm delighted to be here, and I'm particularly pleased to be giving these lectures when I was invited to give these lectures, I thought, this is the book that I wanted to write in the summer of 2012. And in June of 2012, the Atlantic article that you just heard about came out, and my entire life was turned upside down. And pretty much has been for the last 3 years. And I've been working in the work on women and family and men for the last 3 years. But this project that you're going to hear, that's the summer I planned to write it, and I am now writing it. And I actually conceived of it in 2009 and then when I was in government and working for the next 2 years in government and then teaching classes at Princeton on making networks work. So I'm deeply indebted to the Stimson lectures for finally sort of forcing me to pre-commit in a way that meant I actually am able to work on this subject. And it is a subject of, as I said, that I've been studying and thinking about for a very long time. So today I'm going to give you the first lecture, the chessboard and the web. I'm actually going to start the second lecture because the length of the subject matter and the length of the time allotted does not quite track. So we will go, unless I've seriously misjudged the time. I am going to be reading, but I will do my very best to make this as lively as possible. I'm afraid if I don't read, given the amount of content that I have to cover, but also if you push the wrong button in my back, you'll get a book talk, and it'll sound very different than this. So let's dive in. I just want to make sure I know it. Yep, okay, here we go. So the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank by China and 49 other nations in June of this year was generally regarded as a diplomatic fiasco for the United States. The U.S. government sought to block the creation of the bank by urging all of its allies not to participate. It saw the bank as competition for the Asian Development Bank, which was created by the United States, a cluster of Western European nations, and Taiwan, Japan, India, and other Asian nations back in 1966. More broadly, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, was seen as an effort by the Chinese government to create its own international financial institutions as an alternative to the Bretton Woods institutions that were set up, obviously, by the West after World War II. Ironically, President Obama actually fought to increase China's voting share in the World Bank and the IMF, but was blocked by Congress. And in the wake of that, China pursued this initiative in addition to a couple of others. So the U.S. pushed all its allies not to join, but actually our Western European allies were the first to defect. Prime Minister David Cameron announced in March 2015 that Great Britain had important trading relations with China, and that Britain would thus subscribe as a founding member of the AIIB. Germany, France, and Italy followed suit, as did Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea in Asia. Only Japan and Canada held back. So in the traditional terms of geopolitical competition, China won, US 0. Unfortunately, that's exactly the frame of reference that led the US government to adopt the wrong stance toward the AIIB in the first place. Suppose the U.S. had taken a different perspective from the outset, starting from the proposition that more investment in infrastructure, wherever it comes from, is a positive development for the people affected and for regional and ultimately global economic growth. The starting point here is not interstate competition, but rather the level of well-being for citizens globally. The U.S. should still have been concerned at the prospect that AIIB funds might be invested in ways that would benefit corrupt governments more than their citizens, something that we've had plenty of experience with the World Bank. The U.S. might thus rightly want to influence the development of the AIIB in terms of the rules and practices it adopts. So if the U.S. goal were maximizing influence over the development of the AIIB with the aim of benefiting the people of Asia, it would have pursued a very different strategy. Influence requires connection. The more dense the web of relationships, the greater the potential influence. From this perspective, the U.S. should have done exactly the opposite of what it did. It should have encouraged its allies and friends to sign up for the AIIB. We would then have had much more insight into the workings of the bank and much more ability to influence our friends to influence its development. And indeed, that would have been more effective than our joining and doing it ourselves, which would have created antibodies. So working through a web of other friends and allies in the bank. That kind of indirect influence would have been more effective than, if, as I said, if we'd joined it ourselves. So these are the two approaches that I'm going to talk about. The first, which is what we did, was we are in competition with China. This is China's way of exerting influence. We will push back against them. Actually what happened, that backfired, and we're worse off. That's traditional chessboard geopolitics. The second, the approach of thinking about influence, networks of influence, how you construct them, is the strategy of the web. The first approach focuses on states, the second on people. The first approach assumes that the modal relationship between states is competition. The second, that the modal relationship is connection. The first approach assumes that power comes from winning. The second, that power flows from the degree of connectedness and influence. Both approaches are essential for the conduct of contemporary foreign policy. In a complex, connected, and often still conflictual world. But the U.S. government, like most of its peer governments, focuses far more and is far better equipped for the chessboard world than for the web world. So this has a long tradition. Statesmen and foreign policy experts have long been taught to view the world as a chessboard, analyzing the decisions of powerful states and anticipating the reactions of rival states in an endless game of strategic advantage. And indeed, the theoretical basis for interstate bargaining, spelled out by Thomas Schelling in the Strategy of Conflict and by many others since, is game theory. Not necessarily chess, but certainly poker. So if we think about that, this is the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the game of chicken. Right? Remember, we were eyeball to eyeball. Dean Russ said we were eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked. And note, once again, we have the U.S. versus Russia. Fortunately, a few things have changed in this picture. That's Samantha Power, our U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, with the Russian representative. But again, that's the chessboard world of geopolitics. So, as I said, if you think about it, it's the basis with Schelling was game theory, and actually the best example of that kind of chessboard geopolitics now, although a rather gorier version, is Game of Thrones, and again, aptly named. Henry Kissinger recently reminded us in World Order the modern chessboard world is structured by the Peace of Westphalia, which established the concept of state sovereignty and the equality of all states regardless of the nature of their domestic arrangements. When foreign policymakers who are operating in the Kissingerian or Metternichian tradition think about the international system, they see states in eternal competition with other states to advance their national interests. That view of the world is inherently neither bad nor good. It depends on the nature of a ruler or a government. A country's national interests can be defined as world domination or as the welfare of its people or anything in between. So again, the chessboard world remains highly relevant for major domains in foreign policy. And probably in the 1990s and the early aughts, we might not have said that. We thought, I think many people thought, we were moving from the chessboard world to a very different world, certainly in the last 5 years and certainly in the last 2, with the reemergence of Russia not only as a major power, but an aggressive power, looking at China, looking at Iran. No one would say that this is not still highly relevant. But now let's think about what the web world looks like. So before we do, let me say one more thing. This is actually a 3-level chess set. So Joseph Nye, whom I will be referring to quite a bit, particularly in the last lecture, refers to 3-level chess. So this is just to show you how powerful the metaphor is. On the top level is the military system in which the United States is dominant. On the middle level, that's the economic chess game. And then Joe actually tries to say that transnational relations are the bottom level of a 3-level chess game. So I don't play a particularly good game of chess to begin with, and I certainly can't do it on 3 levels at once. And I put to you, it is actually easier to see that bottom level of chess as a separate and parallel world of the web. And I use this slide to show you we're not talking about Charlotte's Web, right? We're not talking about one big center and a web around. We are talking about something that really looks like, imagine a visualization of the internet, where you have a mass of interconnected networks with a number of large nodes and countless smaller ones. Or think about these pictures that we've seen. This is the world at night seen from a satellite, where again, you have very densely interconnected parts of the world, all lit up. And then, of course, you have parts of the world that have far fewer connections. No roads, no lights, and you can simply see where the density of networks is and where it is not. So this is what the web view of the international system looks like, with intersecting networks of people, of groups, of businesses, of institutions, of governments, and of criminals. Criminal networks are a big part of it. So in the international relations literature, and let me just, okay, I will just hold this slide. So in the international relations literature and also in the halls of the State Department, the participants in the web world, actually, let me back up for 1 second. I just realized where we were on the slides. So let me say for one more minute, I said intersecting networks of people and groups and businesses and institutions and government. This is an example of how licit and illicit trade networks are interconnected. This book is now 15 years old, but the point is that the people who are trafficking in drugs and arms and people are often the same people who are trafficking in licit goods. Or similarly, to think about climate networks and increasingly how we are connected by either wind flows, drought conditions, but again, a way of thinking about the world in interconnected zones. Here, networks are sadly and particularly relevant right now, again, thinking about the world in terms of flows and networks of refugees and migrants. And just more generally, if we think about the web world, think of all the different kinds of networks and flows: people, trade, energy, climate, and digital, and you can add your own. When we talk about the web world, we talk about the world of non-state actors, or at least that's the classic way that we think about these actors. Clay Shirky, the futurist and just says this is like calling the automobile a horseless carriage. Right? It is telling you what it is not. It is not telling you what these actors actually are. Yes, we know they're not states. I think it is much more helpful and productive to think about the actors and the nodes and the hubs in networks, and to think of these participants in networks as both nodes in them and creators of them. So states are independent entities that choose whether or not to ally with other states, to connect or not to connect. That's a government decision. Members of a network, on the other hand, matter only to the extent that they are durably connected to other members, which brings the network into being. So you have to, the state of connection is a prerequisite for the web world. So think about ISIS, we're all thinking about ISIS these days, but it is now standard counterterrorist lore to say it takes a network to defeat a network. That's fairly evidently because the efforts to destroy single network nodes, so if you take out a part of a network, produce a game of whack-a-mole in which other nodes replace the one that you took out, sometimes in multiples. General Stanley McChrystal, known to many of you, who says he teaches here, was in charge of the Special Operations Forces charged with destroying al-Qaeda in Iraq. He analogized the al-Qaeda network to Proteus, the Greek god who was forever changing shape. And tomorrow we're going to look at exactly the structure of the network that he was facing and what he did to counter it. So to see the international system as a web is to see a world of networks intersecting, overlapping closely in some places and more strung out in others. We went through, it's the world of global trade, of trafficking, of climate change, of all the networks of sea, air, and land transport. I would say if you think about arms networks, terrorist networks, climate change, disease, the water wars, food insecurity, corruption, all of those are network threats, and I would say those are some of the most pressing 21st century global threats. All right, so these are our lenses, and it's actually relatively easy to think about all global events through both lenses, through both the chessboard and the web. So if you go back, just think about 1949. So most of us who are trained in foreign policy, if you say 1949, we will think, at least those of us who have been educated in the West, will think 1949 is the date NATO was created. The NATO alliance, the Atlantic Treaty that created it, came into being to counter what was then the Soviet Union. If you're a web-trained expert, you're much more likely to think of 1949 as the year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed, standing for all human beings and spreading webs of human dignity. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, chaired the committee that was responsible for the Universal Declaration. And in Ken Burns' film, The Roosevelts, he captures her telling the Soviet delegate Vyshinsky that the UN was created for people, not for states, a web outlook. A couple of frames earlier in that same series, John Meacham is quoted describing her husband at Yalta in perfect chess terms. Roosevelt, he said, never made the first move. So we don't have to just apply this lens to the 21st century, but it's particularly relevant. More recently, in last April, and again very presciently, the columnist Jim Hoagland wrote, Washington should now see to it, as if Washington could, but Washington should now see to it that NATO's Atlantic Resolve mission to bolster Ukraine's neighbors is matched by alliance involvement in the Mediterranean crisis. So the Atlantic Resolve is NATO's mission to stand against Russia in Ukraine. Classic chessboard mission. What Hoagland was saying is actually these flows of refugees, and this was last April, these are every bit as important, and NATO should focus on them. NATO has no idea how. NATO is a chessboard organization. So now let's look at Ukraine itself. I want to talk about a couple actual crises and how it makes a difference to think about this through these different perspectives. So Russia's annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine looks like a classic chessboard gambit. Ukraine is a country that faces both east and west and thus finds itself between two power blocks. Russia seeks to regain its former hegemony over Ukraine. So if you think about it in former Russian terms, obviously Ukraine was a Soviet socialist republic. And Russia is also very unsettled by the prospect of an adversarial alliance, NATO, offering membership to Ukraine and thus threatening Russian territory directly. So when we analyze this from the chessboard point of view, we see Putin resurgent, or we see, depending on our particular point of view, Russia threatened by the expansion of NATO. These are the three potential NATO members, the former Republic of Macedonia, Ukraine, and Georgia. So when the Ukrainian people rejected their government's choice of Russia over the EU, Russia then calculates, in the chessboard perspective, that it can expand its territory and destabilize a neighboring state at an acceptable cost. Other states, either friends of the invaded state or states with a stake in upholding the status quo or the international order weigh both moves and counter moves, trying to figure out the best strategy. From the Webb perspective, the story begins and ends with the Ukrainian people and the choices that they are trying to make. And I would say the choices they have been trying to make since 2007. This is the second revolution we have seen in 10 years where the Ukrainian people rose up against a deeply corrupt government. They've watched as their neighbors to the west have begun to flourish and offered better lives and hope to their children. Ukraine, meantime, has been mired in kleptocracy, vicious and feudal partisanship, and rising inequality and poverty for the majority of its citizens. As I said, they first took to the streets during the Orange Revolution. 6 years later, they actually had ended up back with the very president they had first ousted, and their lives had not improved. So from this vantage point, from the Webb vantage point, what potential membership in the European Union represents to Ukrainians is not a geopolitical choosing of sides. It is not weighing in with the West versus the East. It is their best hope of decent government. A majority of Ukrainians would actually prefer good relations with both Russia and the EU for very good economic and geographical reasons. But what they want is an end to corruption and a functioning democracy. And that also, from the Webb perspective, is the greatest threat that Ukraine presents to Vladimir Putin, which is the specter of a successful revolution against a deeply corrupt government. That is exactly the threat that Putin faced in Moscow in 2011 when hundreds of thousands of educated Muscovites came out to protest the stealing of the Moscow mayoral election. To complicate that picture further, many of these protesters, looking very similar in these two slides, are themselves digitally connected. They have lots of back and forth, lots of contact, and so for Putin, the worst thing that could happen is that these parallel protesters would succeed in Ukraine. So again, both of these perspectives tell an important part of a complicated story. The world of states and the world of networks and flows exist side by side. But the geopoliticians who still run the show in most Western capitals have spent far more time on diplomatic and potential military responses to Russian aggression than on the economic and social strategies designed to stabilize and strengthen the new Ukrainian government. The IMF has negotiated a deal, the EU and the US have sent aid, but we don't have a strategy for helping a very young and inexperienced set of government officials spend those funds and govern in ways that are designed to demonstrate to their constituents that the revolution was worth it. All right, so that's a way to think about Ukraine from both these perspectives. Let's look at the Middle East. All right, so Syria. When I first started thinking about this, we would not have looked at Syria immediately and said that it is the principal source of the EU's threat of migrants, of refugees, which again is a very Webb threat. A chessboard view of Syria, which is the one that the United States has taken for the last 4 years, gives you a classic, again, the U.S. and its allies lined up essentially against the government of Syria, Iran, and Russia on the other side. And in many ways, from that perspective, the U.S. view has been, this is not that important to us. This is not going to affect us directly. We care about Israel's security, but as long as Israel's all right, the fact we don't want to get involved in a proxy war directly, and this, from geopolitically, is just not a major interest. Over the last 3 years, we have watched a political, economic, and humanitarian catastrophe of immense proportions, destroying a country of 22 million people in one of the most strategic and historic locations in the world. As I said, from the chessboard perspective, the view is not, it's just not our fight. Turkey's a NATO ally. As I said, we care about Israel, but Turkey, until recently, even now, hasn't been directly threatened. The use of chemical weapons in defiance of an international ban briefly rose to the level of a vital interest that President Obama was prepared to defend. and the rise of the Islamic State now increasingly, but only in those instances has Syria risen to the top of our foreign policy concerns. From the web perspective, Syria was a virus that was always likely to trigger an epidemic of violence and destabilization spreading far beyond the region. The carriers were multiple. So mass displacement, half of Syria is homeless. Half of 22 million people are homeless, either internally displaced or now externally. So mass displacement, civil war, economic contraction, religious fanaticism. This is the older picture of ISIS carrying out atrocities. Environmental degradation, something we don't pay nearly enough attention to, but there was a huge drought in Syria for much of the aughts, driving people into the cities and making it much harder to actually support them with rising food prices, and essentially human misery on a truly titanic scale, and memories of torture, brutality, and abandonment that will last for generations. Playing international chess has always involved a certain amount of guesswork about what a state is planning. But when we think about the world from the point of view of connected human beings, we can be certain that the parents whose children are being killed before their eyes, families who lose their homes, and young men who see no future will respond with grief, rage, and ultimately violence. Spreading chaos and despair through the web cannot incubate anything good. So the web perspective also invites a much longer time horizon. Over a generation, not intervening in Syria sooner than we probably now are will prove every bit as dangerous to our core interests as the immediate threat of chemical weapons. Human beings can nurse trauma and grudges, as we certainly saw in the Balkans and other places, for generations. And refugee camps are notorious breeding grounds for violent revenge fantasies, as the Israelis know all too well. ISIL will have a steady and regular crop of willing recruits. So the fracturing of Syria, the consequences for neighboring states, and the rise of extremism was both foreseeable and foreseen years ago. But our diplomatic, military, and economic strategies are designed for the chessboard, not the web. If the government uses chemical weapons, we can threaten force. But as a state fractures and sends millions of desperate people over its borders to destabilize its neighbors, as opposition forces splinter and fight one another, and as fanaticism spreads through social networks, kinship networks, and existing terrorist groups, we are caught without either the mental frameworks or the portfolio of policies and tools necessary to respond effectively. Christopher Fussell, who is a New America Fellow and a co-author with General McChrystal and a 15-year veteran of Navy SEAL teams, says, the vast majority of our current system for considering and engaging in conflict is based on and biased by a nation-state-centric optic. As these systems fall, the vacuum will continue to be filled by distributed networks with little recognition of the traditional rules of the game. It is our system, not theirs, that will need to adapt. So let me come back now to the chessboard and the web and talk more theoretically about this framework of how we're going to think about networks and how we actually can develop specific types of networks as foreign policy tools to counter some of these threats. As I said, in 1961, Thomas Schelling published The Strategy of Conflict, where it was just still sort of the most iconic book in most international relations classes. You start with it at some point. And he essentially took game theory, and he looked at relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, and he said, it looks like a zero-sum conflict, but it can be transformed into a positive-sum bargaining game, or rather set of games, where we can, in fact, build on some mutual interests, even while we're in deadly opposition on others. He won a Nobel Prize for Economics, based in part on that work, and it showed foreign policy scholars and policymakers, decision makers, how to operate in a world of constant high-stakes competition. The deterrence game of chicken, the coordination game of stag hunt, the cooperation game of prisoner's dilemma. These were strategies that could be formulated to win them. And in any meeting in the Situation Room in the White House, if you are a scholar listening to the conversation, you can reduce it to that framework. The people talking don't use those terms, but those are the terms they are thinking in. Robert Axelrod then followed Schelling with the evolution of cooperation, outlining the basic tit-for-tat strategy that transforms a prisoner's dilemma from a game in which both players are likely to lose to one in which they could reach a cooperative outcome that is second best for each of them relative to their dominant strategy, but much better than what would actually happen if they both played chicken and collided. We need a similar set of strategies, that basic, that easy to understand, that foundational for what has been an enormous literature, for a world in which the modal relationship is connection rather than competition or conflict. So the country that many would identify as our peer competitor, and note the terms, China, has such a strategy. When my family and I lived in Shanghai in 2007 to 2008, I vividly remember, and it seems parochial to me to say this now, but I vividly remember the first time I saw airline routes that were depicted with China as the hub rather than the United States. So, of course, the United States is this peripheral country off here on the right. China is the center, and then you have Europe off on the left. And as I say, it seems parochial that I wouldn't have thought about the world that way, but we grow up with maps with the U.S. in the center. That's actually exactly the representation that China has of itself when it calls itself the Middle Kingdom, right? It's not thinking of itself the Middle Kingdom as the middle of a hierarchy or the midpoint in a hierarchy, but as the center of a vast web of tributary relations, the center of the universe, in the same way that medieval Western kingdoms imagine the Earth to be the center of our galaxy. Today, China sees itself returning to its historic and rightful place in the world. Its grand strategy is once again to weave a global web of commercial and political relations, which it describes in terms of a Silk Road economic belt to the west of China and a maritime Silk Road to South and Southeast Asia. And when the Chinese describe this strategy, it is absolutely a web of relationships. As U.S. Naval Academy Professor Yang Deng describes it, China's, quote, Silk Road strategy is based upon open networks in Euro-Asia and Maritime Asia strung together through Chinese-financed infrastructure and transportation projects, as well as trade and financial ties. In other words, end quote, in other words, a world of networks in which all roads ultimately lead back to Beijing. Actually, the Obama administration had a similar strategy, and I think it's still there, but it never has articulated the strategy in web terms. In Obama's first inaugural address, he spoke to the nations that the United States had shunned for decades, and he said famously, "We will extend our hand if you will unclench your fist." 7 years later, he has actually convinced Myanmar, Cuba, and Iran to do just that. I actually think this is an enormous achievement of this administration. Extending our hand means opening the door to an entire set of commercial, educational, cultural, and human relations to weave a web of interaction and influence. The problem is that while engagement can be a grand strategy, like containment, we don't actually have the tools to operationalize it in a way that ensures that the connections we build serve specific intended purposes. In the strategy of conflict, we're able to identify different situations that require different sub-strategies to achieve specific outcomes, but engagement, as Obama was often critiqued for exactly this, engagement just means to interact and to connect. And so he was ridiculed for a strategy that sounded like, we'll just go and talk to people, we'll just go and visit, as opposed to a strategy of building specific networks for specific purposes. So the question is, who do we connect, how, when, where, and for what specific purposes? And there we have to turn to network theory, just as Schelling once turned to bargaining theory. Different networks have different properties for different purposes. So recall the great, some of you anyway, will recall, the great blackout of the summer of 2003. Some of you were very young at that point, in which we had an overloaded power grid in Ohio that took out the lights up and down the eastern seaboard. The network was not resilient. It was constructed in such a way that taking out one strand created a cascading effect. Let's see here. I'm going to go, how do I go backwards? Oh, okay, let me go here and then I'll see if I can go backwards. So thinking about it, and we're going to come back to this slide, it was the network was essentially constructed in a way, if you took out one piece, the whole thing came apart. If it had been constructed this way, if it had been constructed as a phone tree in a sort of a decentralized network, you'd have been able to take out the Ohio part in any one of these pods. I'm pointing here and you're looking there. Okay, in any one of these pods, and the whole network, of course, would have stayed up. Alternatively, think about the way a virus spreads through a random but dense arrangement of contacts that can be tracked and mapped as a network, but only after the fact. In the case of a rapidly spreading disease, we use quarantine and isolation to disrupt that network. When a meme goes viral, we marvel at the power of the same kinds of decentralized ad hoc networks to spread information swiftly and broadly. Knowing where the choke points are or the central hubs are in those networks before death or delight spreads across them is critical to both positive and negative strategies of dissemination. So digital technology means that we can actually map human networks in real time. Human connections via voice, keyboard, and face-to-face interactions, whether virtual or real, now all leave digital signatures. So if you slow down the film of cars on city streets, you think about it, you create those trails of light that will quickly fill the city, creating nodes and edges and intersections. You see where the cars have gone, and thus you see the connections between them. In theory, and subject to a new generation of privacy and security regulation, we can track all of human interaction, local to global, in the same way, mapping who is connected to whom, when, and how. So for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to put this project into the context of broader work on networks in multiple disciplines and in international relations, and at the same time trying to show you the ways in which this particular approach offers a blend of description of what's actually out there and prescription that can be particularly valuable for policymakers and that can provide a framework for scholars. So let's start with three broad categories of problems that policymakers and civic groups and foundations and global corporations all try to either solve or to play a part in solving, thinking about sort of these 21st century web problems. I think you can talk about them as resilience problems, as execution problems, and as scale problems. So resilience problems involve avoiding and responding to crises, whether man-made or natural or both, from a direct military attack to an earthquake or to a famine. Execution problems require the execution of a specific task or set of tasks by identifiable individuals or organizations to accomplish a concrete affirmative goal, whether it's addressing a financial crisis, implementing a peace treaty, or finding new ways to reduce carbon emissions. And finally, scale problems arise in situations in which challenges are being met and overcome at the micro level, but not at the macro level. So resilience, execution, and scale. It is possible to identify specific types of networks, resilience networks, task networks, and scale networks that can be tailored to address each of those three categories of problems, and I will break them into subcategories. So I say can be tailored to address specific categories of problems. The choice of that phrase reflects my vantage point, less as a scholar than as a policymaker or expert. as somebody or of the member of the class of people who are responsible for prescribing and implementing solutions. That dual vantage point is very familiar to legal scholars. Lawyers, of course, can change what we write about by writing about it in a way that convinces judges and legislators to act. So we're accustomed to describing a world, analyzing it, writing about it in a way that can actually address problems and change it. That, of course, is very different from a contemporary international relations perspective, from a purely scholarly perspective that is more interested in explaining how the world works. So there are scholars like Miles Kaler or Emily Hafner-Burton and Alexander Montgomery who have looked through network theory and written on network analysis in international relations, reviews the literature, shows you how you can use network analysis to explain phenomena in the international world. I will draw on their insights on Friday when we come back to the subject of power and networks. But overall, those are approaches that seek to analyze and predict the world, while my perspective is much more an effort to shape the world. That means consuming literature from multiple different disciplines and even cherry-picking those approaches that work best to address these problems. Over time, you have to put those two together. Over time, the literature on networks that can predict and describe the world has to be tied to the literature that actually tries to prescribe solutions. As we know more about how networks actually work, we'll know more about how to create them and orchestrate them for specific purposes. Ideally, we will develop an entire area of network studies, at least in public policy schools, that will bring together multiple disciplines, as we have in other interdisciplinary areas, and bring scholars and practitioners together to create a set of studies and, again, policy prescriptions. So for the remainder of this lecture, let me just check my time. Good. I'm going to provide an overview of the approach by talking about what kinds of networks could create new policy alternatives for addressing the problems that we started out with in Ukraine, China, and Syria. So we're going to go back to those three areas and talk about now what networks and what kinds of networks could make a difference. So as I said, if you're trying to figure out how to deter Russia from further destabilizing Ukraine, that's primarily a chessboard question. It involves the classic military and diplomatic tools of deterrence, sanctions, isolation, and negotiation. We have, in fact, the United States and the European Union has succeeded in imposing a high enough price for Russian aggression to negotiate a fragile but thus far lasting deal that has stopped much of the fighting. Certainly not all, and just this weekend we had another outbreak. So the U.S., France, Britain, Germany, and Italy announced yesterday that they will maintain sanctions until Russia fulfills its part of the Minsk deal. And Putin suggested just this week that he may be willing to negotiate a restructuring of a $3 billion bond that Ukraine owes Russia that comes due in December. So I would say that the diplomatic track is slow and unwieldy, but the train is moving. On the other hand, in the longer term, as I said, the biggest defeat that Ukraine could hand Russia would be the greatest victory for the Ukrainian people. It would be a democratic government that delivers the services that Ukrainians want and need in a society that provides both opportunity and prosperity. Large aid packages won't do it. What we need are a set of resilience networks that are designed to strengthen and support people in doing what they already want to do. And these would need to be distributed networks with lots of different nodes and links in multiple directions so that they can withstand any one node being knocked out, just like the power crisis, and can mobilize and reach many different people. More specifically, Ukraine needs a set of stabilization and assistance networks like those that Europe and the United States put in place in Eastern and Central Europe after the fall of the wall. One of the principal values of being a EU candidate member is that the government officials of the candidate country at many levels and in all different policy areas, become members of vast EU policy networks. There is a policy network for everything from agriculture to telecoms to obviously finance, high security. And if you're a candidate member, all your officials and your judges become parts of those networks. They go to meetings, they come to know their counterparts, they absorb not only new practices, but new standards of competence and integrity. It is essentially the diplomatic equivalent of changing a teenager's friends so that peer pressure works in the direction of trying to get into a good college rather than competing to see who can drink the most or stay up the latest. I have great experience in this latter category. And as we know, changing the peer group has an unbelievably powerful effect. And that's essentially, as I said, that's the diplomatic equivalent of just that, when you get government officials and you put them in the context of highly trained professional colleagues. So those stabilization and assistance networks, a subcategory of resilience networks, are not limited to governments. Again, if you take a leaf from the post-Soviet European playbook, you will recall the extraordinary work that George Soros's Open Society Foundations did, teaching fledgling journalists how to write as part of a free press, and working with government officials throughout Central and Eastern Europe, essentially to teach people how an open society works. The American Bar Association ran the European and Eurasian Central European and Eurasian Law Initiative, CELI, which trained and assisted tens of thousands of lawyers, judges, and other legal officials in what the rule of law requires and looks like. This wasn't just about the promotion of U.S. law. CELI participants could offer assistance drawn from multiple legal systems, and they were maximally effective when they worked in a consultative capacity and responded to what lawyers and judges from the country in question needed rather than what we would have thought they needed. Building those networks is hard and often frustratingly slow work. It requires identifying the right officials, ensuring that they are funded to attend meetings and to provide assistance on the ground, encouraging and facilitating regular communication, monitoring how the network is working, and troubleshooting disputes and problems. It's a lot of talk, relationship building, convening, teaching, mentoring, and responding. But it's the stuff that successful institutions are made of. It's the best way to make a government more resilient and withstanding various shocks that all governments encounter, as well as helping to improve its performance, is to ensure that individuals who are trying to do things differently, who are stopping, not taking bribes, putting citizens first, cutting through red tape, to ensure that those citizens are inspired, mentored, or those officials are inspired, mentored, and supported. So turn back to Syria. Honestly, you probably are thinking that the apocalypse in Syria is so brutal and so tangled and so immense that pretty much any policy prescriptions seem either inadequate or futile. But you have to try, and there are ways to at least make things better. So we simultaneously, on the chessboard side, have to work to achieve a political settlement of the Syrian civil war that provides for a transition to some kind of more pluralist government, probably involving Bashar al-Assad for the shorter term, and to defeat ISIS. It's a political settlement that requires chessboard thinking and calculations of the best combinations of carrots and sticks, state to state, to get Assad and his backers, Russia and Iran, to the negotiating table, and how to create a deal that can actually stick given the politics within Syria and across the region. That's exactly what we're trying to do right now. That's what John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov are trying to do in terms of brokering a deal. And the issue in pure chessboard thinking is people like me think that using force in a limited way or creating safe zones will force Assad to the table. So that's chessboard thinking. It's not we're going to win. It's how can we actually create pressure that will get people to the table and get our best bargaining position. But that's chessboard thinking. Defeating ISIS, and I had no idea just how timely this would be when I started thinking about this. will actually need the same kind of web approach that General McChrystal and his co-authors describe in his book, Team of Teams. Battling al-Qaeda in Iraq, they transformed U.S. Special Forces from a hierarchy into a network, we'll see tomorrow, the structure that is a team of teams. They discovered when they started that as a hierarchy fighting a network, they were completely outpaced, that the decentralization of the al-Qaeda network and the speed with which autonomous teams could share knowledge and act left even our special forces operators flat-footed. As they adapted, they learned how to create an action network, a loose structure that is nevertheless organized and coordinated enough to accomplish a specific task. That network was based on the principles of shared consciousness and empowered execution, a distributed network in which McChrystal and his immediate staff served as the central node for convening and supporting, but in which every member of the network provided and received information and was empowered to act on it. And as I said, tomorrow when we go through network structures, I will show you a slide of what that looks like. New technological tools that map real-time communications among people in the way that public health officials map the spread of diseases, identifying the central nodes and monitoring emotional valence can turn an enemy network into a continual source of actionable information. So I watched this summer as someone who essentially studies social media the way you study epidemiology, can take not only the tweets, ISIS's tweets, but can show you who's connected to whom, who's retweeting them, and equally, as I said, the emotional valence of those tweets by various word analyses, what kinds of words are used, how angry they are, where they're going, what kind of responses. So you literally can turn mass communication into a network that allows you to see who's where and what their level of activity and emotion is. A longer-term option to help the Syrian people and indeed the entire region is to radically change the way we think about refugees and the way we see refugee camps, which is an idea that Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who's chair of the National Democratic Institute, has promoted. Instead of seeing camps as concentrations of the desperate and the dispossessed, the weak and the vulnerable who are waiting for a day of return that may never come, we should see them as hubs of education, enterprise, and equal rights that can anchor networks of relatives and friends that extend back home and around the world. Individuals who are seeking refuge from a toxic and deadly environment could be welcomed into camps or indeed cities where the global community, represented by international institutions, NGOs, and governments and citizens of other countries, have a chance, in fact, to implant ideas of what a very different life could look like, to create a self-functioning economy, to encourage entrepreneurship, and to educate the entire population in liberal self-government. We have 60 million refugees around the world. 60 million. That's the size of Belgium, Hungary, Israel, and a host of Nordic countries put together. And that's the way to think about it. We have entire countries of refugees who are on the move. We may not be able to change the conditions within their homelands, but again, we can give them an entirely different set of tools for when they go back. So you're looking at me and you're thinking, oh, right, these are the same refugees that people in France, many of our own governors, many of our own members of Congress are shutting the door to. Definitely complicated politics and always have been. But there are other alternatives. So the Egyptian billionaire, Naguib Sawiris, is right now negotiating with the owners of 2 Greek islands with a plan to resettle hundreds of thousands of refugees and put them to work building the infrastructure of a community, of a small town, of a city on an island. Greece actually has between 600 and 1,500 islands. That's actually the same strategy that China is pursuing with the people in its agricultural regions, right? It's creating cities, and it's bringing people into the cities and creating economies, sources of education, different ways of living together. You think this is crazy, but Business Insider ran an article this past summer listing the 11 cheapest Greek islands for sale, and you can turn to the website Private Islands online. It seems crazy, but why on earth not? Why wouldn't you take islands that somebody could buy as a resort and create a safe place where you could in fact build an infrastructure for hundreds of thousands of people and create a hub, a positive hub of economics, of democracy, of education, of opportunity? If you think about that, and you think about that approach prospectively, and that I do think is a more realistic approach than Peter Thiel's idea of seasteading, but we could combine that too rather than homesteading. You actually have a world that is far more both prepared for and resilient to the continuing flows of millions of people. Right now, the camps, wherever refugees are hubs for something very different. They're hubs for terrorism, revenge fantasies, armed insurgency in many parts of the world. They could become hubs of a better life. So now let's go back to China and talk about the successful launch of the AIIB and America's unsuccessful attempt to block it. I said at the outset, if we'd taken the web view of the world, we wouldn't have tried to block it, but we did. We could now support the bank, and we are now saying we think this is a very good idea, making the best of, making virtue of necessity. We can encourage our allies and build lots of links of influence, but equally important is to build a network of diverse government, corporate, civic, and individual actors embodying what the State Department calls a new model of development. In the second quadrennial diplomacy and development review, the State Department says countries require investments from multiple sources to achieve sustained and inclusive economic growth. Initiatives such as Feed the Future, the U.S. Global Development Lab, and Power Africa combine local ownership, private investment, innovation, multi-stakeholder partnerships, and mutual accountability. So instead of the old model of development of massive flows of government aid, which is still the Chinese model of development, this is a far more diverse model that brings together a whole group of different actors. Those networks, if you imagine applying that model to Southeast Asia and recognizing the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank as one model of development, but adopting our model and creating networks across Southeast Asia, those would be replication networks. That's my third category. We said resilience networks, action networks, and replication networks. That would be structuring links among existing actors in ways that encourage the replication of a particular form, model, organization, or message. So the mechanism of replication can happen if you deliberately cross-fertilize approaches that are working from the center, or you can build it into the nodes themselves. The way to think about it is where you have successful projects, and there are many successful development projects engaged in by many different actors. The problem is how to scale them. But if you create networks that in fact allow for that cross-fertilization in very efficient ways, and we'll look at some examples tomorrow, it's the equivalent of watching a meme go viral over social media, just in more in slow motion. That model, a replication network, does look more like a hub and spokes network. It has a very strong center, and it has to, because you have to have connectors and communicators, cross-fertilizers, and collaboration managers who work to activate the links among the different nodes and to create new ones. And so those networks have a different structure and a particular kind of activity at the hub. So we might imagine creating the Asian Development Alliance with an actual hub in Jakarta or Singapore and a number of smaller hubs in other Asian cities, all linking as many corporate, government, and civic development projects as possible. It could spread examples like Power Africa, which is a transaction-centered approach that fosters power deals among host governments, the private sector, and donors to create a more bottom-up approach to providing energy, Or you could replicate successful efforts by many companies to work on strengthening health and education systems in communities where they work. We could create, so that's an example where we could create a replication network as an alternative to the Chinese development perspective, ways of thinking about refugees that are, right now we simply don't have very effective approaches, or thinking about how you stabilize the Iranian government, the Ukrainian government. So I'm going to move to questions shortly. Let me just talk about the time frame here, because the biggest difference, or one of the biggest differences between the chessboard model and the web model is the time frame. In a crisis, you typically do need chessboard tools. You've got to act. You can't say, let's build a network. You have to act quickly. And that, again, comes back to sanctions, the use of force, threats of force, diplomatic bluffing, but things that can be done reasonably quickly. Strategies of connection, the web strategies of connection, tend to be much longer-term tools. Building these takes time, but the patience and the care that you put into their creation can pay off. So think about our own successful long-term strategy of containment, the classic grand strategy. In addition to building alliances of nations, which we did, the American government and many U.S. civil society groups built support and resilience networks for movements like Solidarity in Poland, the Czech Underground, and East German church groups. Those networks emerged over years, even decades, and actively inserted themselves into national politics only at key moments. But they were there. They were underground, sustaining opposition activists and expanding their operations over those decades. Supporting those networks with money and material assistance is not nearly as flashy as imposing sanctions or threatening force, but it is often much more effective. Web strategy is also much more likely to be positive strategy, building and developing and supporting new institutions and organisms in places where they are weak and non-existent, replicating best practices, forging a shared consciousness among teams that need to act closely together. It is again the way in which I started out in talking about what Hillary Clinton calls smart power, integrating the tools of diplomacy and development. So if we think about looking at the world through these dual lenses, as I said, chessboard and the web, states and people, nations and networks, all at the same time. It means understanding how one world blends into the other, as when the United States proclaims its desire to stand up for universal values, but then acts on strictly self-interested power calculations. We think about how those two worlds have to come together. It means thinking through the strategies of both conflict and connection and having the tools available to implement them. We know how to assemble a coalition of nations to impose sanctions on Iran and a group of great powers to conduct negotiations to ensure that Iran is not building a bomb. We don't know how to build commercial, educational, and social networks with the Iranian people, networks that would provide resilience against government propaganda, that would build webs of collaborative scholarship and research, and jumpstart new enterprises in both countries. Yet, network building is just as important to 21st century foreign policy as nuclear negotiations. Welcome to the web. Thank you.
Thank you for a very stimulating lecture. Professor Shabir would be here, so we asked him to handle the Q&A. My name is Bruno Montero. We have 20 minutes before the reception, so please ask questions.
Yes. Oh, you.
You were talking about building networks and how it's a long-term proposition and it's complex. And if you think about some of these situations where you want to build the networks that are so chaotic and so dangerous, you'd want to go in and start this long-term process in such a way that it wouldn't be derailed. I mean, do you have any sense, or where would people look to find some notion of how they could get started in ways that they wouldn't be one step forward and two steps back? How could you get enough traction in this little steps that you would do in this the beginning of a long-term process? How would you go about?
So so when a country is smack in the middle of crisis, I think what I'm hearing you say, it's obviously that's very difficult to go in and start. I mean, if right now in Syria, the things I'm talking about, we would have had to do some time ago, although we can implement network strategies around refugees. I think the way you think about it is as part of ordinary foreign policy. And on Friday, I'll talk about leading in a networked world, exercising power in a networked world. And what you think about is, so there are plenty of fragile states out there, and we know that. And we're constantly struggling with what do you do with fragile states. It's not really development in the economic sense. They're not ready. And so you can think about, if you have the right sort of mental maps, okay, what kind of networks do we need? I'd just take one example, women's networks, very helpful in conflict, right? We know that what happens is the conflicts breaks out, women are excluded. We know that when women are at the peace table, we get much better solutions. We often get to a solution more than we do when it's all male, but then it's too late. It's a classic example of your story. You can't force a government to bring women to the peace table. What you can do long term is create networks of women, and you can create them across ethnic divides or religious divides. You can empower them to effectively provide commentary on peace negotiations and their own proposals as if they were at the table, but not. Now, to do that, you don't have to, you can do that. You could have done that at, say, the outset of the Syrian conflict. You could have said, you could see things coming, you could see religious divides. There were definitely ways to put money into this and energy into this. That's one example. And I think, again, lots of people understand the desire to do this in the State Department, and we're developing ambassadors to youth or ambassadors to women or ambassadors to civil society. What we don't have is anything more than let's have a conference, let's have some exchanges, and then let's hope we build relationships. And what I want to do is say, no, here's the network you have to build, here's the structure of it, here's who has to be in it, and here's how we have to support it. And then, finally, it has to get as much funding and attention as the diplomatic negotiations. Yes?
So talk a little bit about situations where what somebody might want out of a network situation would be quite different from what somebody else might want out of a chessboard thing,
Yes.
right? So the chessboard thing is we want to win, right? And this other thing is a bunch of different things you might want out of it. Because part of the way you seem to be answering her was this is a way to get through the network process
Yes.
to where we would really have liked to have gotten through the chessboard process if we could. So just
Yes.
spell out those.
Oh, and it's a question that opens up a vast canvas of what of 21st century foreign policy should look like. So I'll just give you one example, and just to frame it. So, the United States Embassy in China started tweeting air quality. This was a couple summers ago when the air quality was terrible, and the Chinese were putting out vastly underestimated assessments of the amount of particles in the air. And, this is deadly stuff. So the U.S. started sending out accurate tweets. And very quickly, the Chinese social media picked it up. And so it went on to the Chinese networks. Now, that would be an example of what you would call people to diplomacy. I might say you could build environmental networks to actually monitor air quality. It doesn't have to be through the State Department. Well, the Chinese, of course, thought that was a violation of their sovereignty. And now our response was, well, we've got Americans living in China, and we're going to put this out, and you can't stop us from doing this for our own people, but more generally, we're just providing information. It gets at the question of whether engaging people, which Secretary Clinton always, she said, we're doing government-to-government diplomacy, government-to-people diplomacy, and people-to-people diplomacy. When we have relations with China, Does that mean we have relations with the Chinese government, or does that mean we have relations with its people? So what I'm suggesting is both, and I'm formalizing that. I'm saying, actually, we live in both worlds at the same time. Now, it is always within a government's power to isolate its people, right? You can be North Korea. But if you don't want to isolate your people, and of course you can monitor their speech, you can do everything you want to make this harder. But if you're not going to isolate your people, then you are living in the world of the web. And in the world of the web, there's a new set of foreign policy tools. And there will be conflicts, and that's what I said. In some cases, our government will say, nope, we're cutting these ties. But that happens already. Sometimes we don't pay attention to human rights for national security reasons, and sometimes we do, and that upsets our business. But I am suggesting exactly that you simply insist that you conduct foreign policy on parallel tracks, and that it is necessary to address the threats that we face. Yeah. You can't ask a question.
When you said web, if I'm used to thinking about international policies from the chessboard perspective, when you say web, I think spider web.
Yes.
I don't, right?
Right.
So I think web is a tool of power, is a tool to get my enemies where I want them. And so what in your... So it's a way of thinking, right? So what prevents the web to be used from others, from the United States, by the United States and also by others, to further their goals, just the way the chessboard is used to further their goals?
Yeah.
And if nothing can be done to prevent that, what really differentiates the two?
Oh, this is all about furthering our goals. I mean, I started from the point of view of a foreign policymaker. I'm all for furthering our goals. And yes, absolutely, other governments will do the same, right? But the question is, what's furthering our goals to stop the next global pandemic? What's furthering our goals to counter China in terms of its development influence? What's furthering our goals in thinking about climate change? Right? So my point is, we have all these problems that we do not have the tools to further our goals with. The chessboard tools just won't do it. And so what happens is because we hold conferences and we have exchanges, and we've been having exchanges forever, but there's nothing strategic about it. That's why this is the strategy of connection. There's no strategic thinking of, well, if as I think of when I'm in the chessboard world, if I think, well, let's see, we could play chicken, or we could cooperate, or we could get a third party and find a way to coordinate our action. I at least know what to do when I think about what category I'm in. I don't in this area. But no, these are two ways that the United States will advance its interests. And yes, absolutely. Once, as I said, China does think this way much more than we do. We're just not countering it because we don't think this way. I think that in many ways it's a more of an imperial view, and also China has overseas Chinese throughout East Asia and is more accustomed, as I said, to thinking in those terms. And then you'll have to learn how to counter their webs or their networks. Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm fascinated by your talk about the networking game, and it reminds me of Dr. Kissinger's what Dr. Kissinger wrote on China about the difference between the chess mindset and the goal mindset, which is a perspective of building connections and in the sense of grand strategy, and so thank you for enlightening us on that. So in the meantime, the chess, well, the network paradigm is one difficulty I'm having with the paradigm is how to find the focus and how to define the priorities when you're spreading out in all directions. How do you develop strategically in the new mindset?
Okay, so thank you. So that is just fascinating. I will go back and look at the Kissinger book, particularly because in Kissinger's book World Order, which is the ultimate chess book, chessboard account, he never once mentions women, climate. He does mention terrorism. He never mentions energy. He never mentions development. So in his mindset, all of this stuff that I think we have to grapple with and have networks is just not there. And yet he's describing that mindset. So I will go back and look at that. I'm grateful to you for that. That could add a very interesting dimension to this. So the question of focus, these two questions are united, because I'm imagining you set priorities the way we try to set priorities now, although, again, Secretary Clinton often said that when she became Secretary of State, she called former Secretaries of State to ask their advice. And they all said, you know, pick a couple of things and focus on theirs. And then she would say, so as between Al-Qaeda or the Pakistani Taliban advancing on Islamabad, the H1N1 epidemic, the fallout from the global financial crisis, the climate change, and whatever else was on the table, where am I supposed to pick and choose? In other words, which of those do you want me not to focus on? Which is just a reflection of an increasingly complex set of challenges. And I think anybody in government now will say, if you think of various weeks with President Obama, just when it couldn't get any worse, Ebola broke out. I mean, we're saying, and so I think, so that is a problem for the chessboard world. So that's just a problem that you're now dealing with chessboard threats and web threats at the same time. How you prioritize them, often you can't. Often you have to work on both of them at the same time. My point is, but if you can't, if you say, well, all right, we're going to deal with Syria first and then Ukraine and then Ebola, I don't think you can. Depends, right? Or right now, if you think about the climate conference in Paris, or you think about global arms trafficking or drugs trafficking, my point is that regardless of the priority you put, what this gives you is a set of strategic tools. So it isn't changing who's represented, and it's not changing what are the most important problems. That's to be decided by whoever is in charge. It is to say that when the person in charge says, what are we going to do in Ukraine, we say, well, here's the immediate strategy, and here's the longer term strategy. Or we say, we see a country that's starting to fall apart. What do we do? Can we put in networks that will actually make a difference in addition to whatever diplomacy we've got?
I'm surprised that you didn't mention the drought in Syria as part of climate change.
I meant to. Sorry. It is. It's actually in my category of climate change impacts.
Do you agree with President Obama that climate change is the most serious foreign policy or global issue that we have to face in the future? And if so, could you discuss it in terms of the web versus the chessboard?
That's a great question. That's a great question. Yes, I do agree, and I agree. I mean, for the last 10 years, actually in 2006, I ran the Princeton Project on National Security, and we had a lot of people to come in to rank the greatest challenges. And there were all these former directors of policy planning, and nobody mentioned pandemics or climate change. And we had a presentation on both, and I came away thinking both were extremely important, and they're not disconnected, again, absolutely not. But at that point, by 2008, the government department that was most focused on climate change was not EPA and it was not energy, it was the Pentagon. Because when your land is no good, you move, right? Or when you're underwater, when your land dries up, you move. And that's the oldest source of conflict in human history. You move and the people next door do not say, come on down, right? They fight. So they're looking at Southeast Asia. They're looking at all these trouble spots already that are going to get much, much worse. So I do agree. So this is one where, again, the chessboard perspective says we need a treaty. We need a treaty, right? That's what we've been trying to get. Meanwhile, the web perspective is where Bill Clinton and Bloomberg have been now for 10 years with the C40, looking at global cities. I would have thought, if you were really thinking in this perspective from the government's point of view, you'd have said, okay, fine, we'll negotiate for a treaty, but that's going to take forever. Let's put together the greatest source of emissions globally through cities. Cities have a huge and immediate incentive to get it right in lots of ways for air pollution reasons and other reasons. And then let's work together with the Bloombergs and the Gateses and the people to create a global coalition, which would be a kind of network to counter climate change on the ground. And it wouldn't be either or, but it would be much more deliberate. Now, in fact, as I said, there is the C40, but the C40 is not nearly as strong as it would have been if you'd put government power behind it. So that's just one example of how you could do that. You could then think even more locally and start thinking at the state level and have a set of best practices that cities can sign up to. They're starting to do that now on the Convention on Discrimination, on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, right? In other words, there are ways that cities, it's not binding, it's not a treaty, but you can't stop cities from doing it. So that's what I would have done.
Thank you. Thank you. Please join us for our reception outside. Of course, please join me in.
Thank you.